There is a moment, and I need you to sit with this because it is not a metaphor, it is a diagnostic fact. There is a moment, usually somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the mind's security system goes offline. The rationalizations that run on a kind of autopilot all day, the ones that say you're fine, this is fine, everyone feels this way, you're being dramatic, those go quiet. The productivity hacks stop working. The ambient noise you've carefully curated into your evenings, the podcast about true crime, or the YouTube channel about van life, or the Netflix series you're not even watching but need playing in the background, all of it goes dark, and in that silence, something else speaks, not loudly. Not in words exactly. It speaks in the language of a chest that won't loosen and eyes that won't close and a specific, grinding ache that doesn't have a name in any medical textbook, but that you recognize immediately, the way you'd recognize the face of someone you once loved very much and then hurt very badly. That ache is not insomnia. It is not anxiety, though anxiety has learned to rent out the same address. That ache is the soul presenting its invoice. And the mind, your mind, my mind, the mind of every brilliant and terrified person who has ever stared at a ceiling at 3 in the morning, that mind will do almost anything to avoid paying it. I want to talk about that avoidance. Not the dramatic kind, not addiction or breakdown or the spectacular implosion that makes for good memoir, but the quiet, socially celebrated, completely invisible kind. The kind that looks like ambition. The kind that looks like responsibility. The kind that looks, from every external angle, like a life well managed. My friend Priya, she's a radiologist, 41, with 2 kids and a mortgage on a house she bought because it was the right size and in the right school district, making complete sense on paper, told me something over drinks last year that I haven't been able to forget. She said, "I think I've been good at everything I never wanted." She laughed when she said it, a specific laugh people use to diffuse the things they mean most. Then she took a long sip of wine and stared at the middle distance, the way people do when a sentence they just spoke is slowly turning over in their chest and becoming something they can't quite contain. She wanted to be a poet. At 22, she had 2 poems published in a small literary journal in Edinburgh. She still has the copies. They're in a box in the attic, and she told me she hasn't opened that box in 9 years, not because she doesn't think about it, but because when she gets close, something happens in her throat that she doesn't know what to do with. It's easier not to look, she said, and I understood that completely. I understand it in a way that implicates me. Because here's what the mind does, and it does this brilliantly. It's in service of your survival, which is why it's so hard to call it what it is. The mind builds a case. A meticulous, airtight, completely reasonable case for why the thing that is calling to you from somewhere deep and wordless and insistent cannot, under present circumstances, be honored. The case is always slightly different, but the structure is always the same. It involves responsibility. It involves timing. It involves a person or a set of people who depend on you and whose dependence you have, somewhere along the way, confused with a reason to stop being yourself. The case is always presented as selflessness. The surrender always wears the costume of maturity. Carl Jung dedicated much of his intellectual life to understanding what he called the shadow, the parts of the self that the conscious ego refuses to accept, including desires, wounds, and unfinished business that get pushed below the surface, not because they cease to exist, but because recognizing them threatens the identity the ego has worked so hard to build. Jung wasn't only talking about dark, dramatic issues like murderous impulses or buried traumas. He was also addressing something more ordinary and, in some ways, more damaging. The parts of yourself you find inconvenient. The ambitions you consider impractical. The grief you see as self-indulgent. The love you never fully expressed, because doing so would make you too vulnerable. Vulnerability, learned early as dangerous in how life works, gets stored away. Jung's argument, and he spent 40 years making it, is that what you don't integrate doesn't disappear. It builds up and finds other forms. It manifests as symptoms. I want you to hold that idea for a moment because I know the objection already forming in you, and it is a serious objection that deserves to be met seriously. The objection is this, that this kind of language, the soul, the unacknowledged self, the body keeping score, is the language of privilege. That it is the province of people with enough comfort and security and leisure to contemplate what their deepest selves might require. That the single mother working 2 jobs does not have the luxury of asking whether her soul feels seen. That the migrant laborer sending half his wages home to a family he hasn't seen in 3 years is not in a position to grieve his abandoned ambitions. That most of the human beings alive on this planet right now are occupied with survival in a way that makes this entire conversation a kind of expensive decoration, beautiful and useless. This objection is not wrong, and anyone who dismisses it too quickly is selling something. The material conditions of a life are real, and they constrain what is possible. To pretend otherwise is to participate in a particular kind of cruelty dressed up as inspiration. The woman working 3 jobs to keep her kids fed is not failing to live authentically. She is doing something far more heroic than authenticity. But here is where the objection, although valid, is not entirely complete, because the soul's memory does not operate on a means-tested basis. It does not grant exemptions based on how understandable your circumstances are. The suppression of grief, ambition, love, or identity, these do not become less costly because the reasons for suppression are legitimate. They may be more forgivable. They may be, given the circumstances, entirely unavoidable. But being forgivable and being free of cost are not the same. And the cost, when it comes, and it always does, is often paid by the next generation, which is the particular cruelty of this mechanism. The parent who never became what they needed to be raises a child amid the atmosphere of that failure, even when the parent says nothing about it. Especially when the parent says nothing about it, the unspoken thing in a household takes up more space than the spoken one. There is a man I know named Thomas. He is 54 years old, and he spent 22 years as a civil engineer in a firm. He joined right out of university because his father was a civil engineer, and the path was clear, and following it required no explanation. He was competent. He was reliable. He received promotions at the appropriate intervals. He coached his son's football team on Saturdays and took his wife to the same restaurant on their anniversary every year and lived, by every visible metric, a correct life. What Thomas never told anyone, not his wife, not his closest friends, not even the therapist he started seeing at 47 when his doctor grew concerned about his blood pressure, was that he had known since he was 19 years old that he wanted to make music, not as a hobby, not as a side project. He had known it the way you know the things that are non-negotiable about you, in your bones, deep within you, in the place that doesn't argue. He played piano. He composed. At 19, he wrote a piece that his music teacher told him was genuinely remarkable, and that remark terrified him more than any failure had, because it meant the thing was real, and if the thing was real, then he had to either pursue it or abandon it, and abandoning something real about yourself requires a completely different kind of violence than abandoning a passing whim. He chose the engineering degree. He made the right decision by all external standards. He told himself for 22 years that the music was still there, that he'd return to it, that there was time, and that retirement wasn't too far off. His wife found him, at 52, sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, not crying exactly, but making a sound she had never heard him make before, a sound she later described to me as something between grief and fury. That evening, he found a recording on an old cassette tape of the piece he wrote at 19. He hadn't listened to it in over 30 years. When she asked what was wrong, he said, "I don't know who I've been this whole time." Not dramatically, quietly, with a kind of exhaustion that wasn't about that night. Thomas eventually left the firm. I want to be honest about what happened because the honest version is more helpful than the redemptive one. He didn't leave at 52, inspired and motivated by that night in the kitchen. He left at 54, after 2 more years of mounting misery that looked like a midlife crisis from the outside and felt like a slow-motion emergence from anesthesia from the inside. The emergence was not graceful. He and his wife went through a crisis so severe that they almost didn't survive it, not because she didn't love him or want him to be happy, but because when someone you've built a life with begins to become someone new, even if that new person is closer to who they really are, the ground shifts in ways that feel threatening and confusing to everyone involved. His income dropped by 60%. His professional identity, which he hadn't realized until he lost it, was doing significant structural work in his sense of self-worth and vanished overnight. There were months when he doubted everything, including the music. And here is the part I need you to hold. The music did not immediately vindicate him. There was no sudden flowering of genius unlocked by authenticity. He had to relearn things. He had to confront the gap between who he had been at 19 and who he was at 54, and that gap was real, and it hurt in a specific way that he later described as grieving the years without being able to rage at the person who took them, because the person who took them was me. He plays now. He teaches piano to children on Thursday evenings and to adults on Saturday mornings. He composed a cycle of pieces last year that will never be famous, and that he played at a small venue to an audience of about 40 people, some of whom were not paying particularly close attention. By the metrics of the life he left, it was a failure. By the metrics of the life he was living from the inside, it was the first night in 22 years that he drove home without the specific hollowness that had been his constant companion. That distinction between the failure that looks noble and the success that feels hollow is, I think, the whole game. The mechanism that held Thomas in place for 22 years has a name. It is not weakness, and it is not stupidity, and it is emphatically not a character flaw. It is something that neuroscience and behavioral psychology have been slowly mapping with increasing precision, and the map is both clarifying and humbling. What held Thomas, and what holds most of us in the configurations that contradict what we most deeply are, is a cluster of interlocking systems. The brain's negativity bias, which evolved to weight potential loss more heavily than potential gain, and which means that the thing you might lose by changing always feels more vivid and real than the thing you might become. The terror of identity discontinuity, which is the fear that if you become who love the person you have been may not love the person you have been may not love inhibition, the trained capacity, the trained capacity, the trained capacity, the trained capacity to notice pain and immediately translate it into something manageable, something that does not inconveniently demand your attention right now. Set up and crash them at the cover. The TV Robin says, to work it defend by stations that the tacity to read it into the prestia so. And here is the part I need you to hold. The music did not immediately vindicate him. There was no sudden flowering of genius unlocked by authenticity. He had to relearn things. He had to confront the gap between who he had been at 19 and who he was at 54, and that gap was real, and it hurt in a specific way that he later described as grieving the years without being able to rage at the person who took them, because the person who took them was me. He plays now. He teaches piano to children on Thursday evenings and to adults on Saturday mornings. He composed a cycle of pieces last year that will never be famous, and that he played at a small venue to an audience of about 40 people, some of whom were not paying particularly close attention. By the metrics of the life he left, it was a failure. By the metrics of the life he was living from the inside, it was the first night in 22 years that he drove home without the specific hollowness that had been his constant companion. That distinction between the failure that looks noble and the success that feels hollow is, I think, the whole game. The mechanism that held Thomas in place for 22 years has a name. It is not weakness, and it is not stupidity, and it is emphatically not a character flaw. It is something that neuroscience and behavioral psychology have been slowly mapping with increasing precision, and the map is both clarifying and humbling. What held Thomas and what holds most of us in the configurations that contradict what we most deeply are, is a cluster of interlocking systems. The brain's negativity bias, which evolved to weight potential loss more heavily than potential gain, and which means that the thing you might lose by changing always feels more vivid and real than the thing you might become. The terror of identity discontinuity, which is the fear that if you become who you actually are, you will, in some sense, kill the person you have been, and what the psychologists call emotional inhibition. The trained capacity, trained by parents who meant well, trained by parents who meant well, trained by culture that consistently rewards productive performance over authentic presence. The trained capacity to notice pain and immediately translate it into something manageable, something that can be set aside, something that does not inconveniently demand your attention right now. What Eleni had wanted, had known since she was 12 and spent 3 months filling notebook after notebook with writing her mother called daydreaming, and her school called a gift she should be careful not to indulge, was to write. Not necessarily to be a writer as a career, but to write in the sense of the thing she was most fully alive doing. She stopped at 20. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. There was always something more urgent, always a reason to postpone, always a way to frame the not doing as temporary, rather than as a choice with growing consequences. By 37, she told me, she felt something like a slow erasure. Like I was becoming less legible to myself, she said. Like I knew I was there, but I couldn't quite read myself anymore. She began writing again. I want to be careful here not to turn this into a triumph story, because what happened when she started again was not triumphant. What happened was that for the first 3 months, Everything she wrote was terrible. Not in the way of a beginner. She knew how sentences worked. She always had. But terrible in the way of someone trying to speak a language they haven't used in 15 years, where the vocabulary is there but the fluency is gone, and the gap between what you hear in your head and what comes out when you try to say it is crushing. She stopped twice. She went back twice. She went back twice. She cried more in those 6 months than she had in the previous decade, not because the writing was bad, but because something that had been locked was opening, and the process of opening it was not peaceful. It was like trying to pry a sealed window that has been painted shut, and your hands hurt, and you're not sure the glass isn't going to shatter. Her marriage did not survive the process. That is a fact I will not soften, because softening it would be a lie of omission. Her husband was not a bad man. He was a man who had fallen in love with a particular version of Eleni, and who, when a different and in some ways more difficult and demanding version of Eleni began to emerge, felt not only threatened but genuinely grieved. He was losing someone he loved, and she was becoming someone she could live with. Both of those things were true at the same time, and the tragedy of their being true simultaneously cannot be resolved by a simple ending. Some costs of the soul's accounting are truly tragic, not noble, just tragic, the kind of tragedy that arises when two true things are incompatible. She writes now. She published a collection of essays last year with a small press, which will not make her wealthy or famous. She lives in a smaller apartment than the one she shared with her husband. Recently, she told me she is the most frightened she has ever been, and beneath that fear, something she hadn't expected, solid ground. Like I actually have ground under my feet, she said. I didn't know I'd been standing on air the whole time. I only know how to report that exactly as she said it. Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz and Dachau, and who arrived at his theory of meaning-making, not in a comfortable European study, but in the specific hell of a concentration camp, where every external symbol of human dignity had been systematically stripped away, made a claim that has haunted me ever since I first seriously encountered it. He said that even in the most extreme circumstances, in conditions of total physical bondage, the one freedom that cannot be taken away is the freedom to choose one's attitude toward suffering. I need to be cautious here because Frankl's argument has been grotesquely misused by the self-help industry as a kind of bootstrap theology, implying that if a Holocaust survivor could choose his attitude, you have no excuse for your unhappiness. That is not what Frankl meant, and using him in that way is an act of profound intellectual dishonesty. What Frankl emphasized was something more specific and more devastating. That meaning is not given by circumstances but created by the self's relationship to those circumstances. He argued that refusing to create meaning, whether consciously or not living as if the inner life is irrelevant, is itself a form of death that comes before physical death, and in some ways, is more complete. He observed people in the camps make this choice. He saw individuals decide there was no internal worth to protect, no self-worth to maintain, and he watched them die more quickly and thoroughly than those who, even in extreme situations, kept something alive inside. He was not romanticizing suffering. He was asserting that the self, the true internal self, is not a luxury. When everything else is taken away, it remains the last irreducible part. Those who abandon it before losing anything are living a form of preemptive surrender. The psychologist James Pennebaker spent decades studying what happens to the body when people write honestly about their deepest wounds, not reflectively or therapeutically, but rawly, in timed writing sessions where the goal is only to get the truth out of the body and onto the page. The results were physiological, not just psychological. Immune function improved, doctor visits decreased, and markers of inflammatory stress dropped. The act of externalizing the internal, of giving the soul's held knowledge a form in the world, had measurable biological consequences. The body does not need the problem to be solved, it needs the truth to be acknowledged. This is almost absurdly important. The body's burden is not the problem itself. It is the isolation of carrying the problem alone, in silence, within the carefully maintained fiction that it does not exist or does not matter or has been handled. This is why change, when it occurs, is not dramatic. It does not resemble the transformation story you have been sold. The person who finally begins to turn toward what they have been avoiding does not feel inspired. They initially feel a kind of cellular dread, indistinguishable from the physical sensation of falling. Because they are falling out of the structure they built to protect themselves from their own life. The structure, however uncomfortable it was to live in, was at least familiar, at least navigable, at least organized around a logic they had internalized. What lies on the other side of the structure is not clear. It is not the promised life. It is not the artistic flourishing, the professional fulfillment, or the relationship depth that the mind, in its good moments, sometimes imagines. What is on the other side is raw material and undifferentiated possibility. An undifferentiated possibility is terrifying in a way that the already determined path never is, because the determined path, however wrong, at least provides a sense of direction. But here is the strange thing, and it is strange enough that I want to say it carefully. Once the falling begins, once the first honest look at the ignored thing becomes available and is not immediately retracted, there is a simultaneous quality to the experience that is almost impossible to describe in the language of either triumph or defeat. People who have been through it, who have turned to face the thing the mind was keeping out of sight, tend to use sensory language to describe it, not conceptual language, not the language of transformation or growth or any of the categories we have for positive change. They say things like, "It felt like something released in my chest." They say, "The light looked different that week." They say, "I was driving home and I noticed for the first time in months that I was actually in the car, actually driving, not just existing somewhere behind my eyes while my hands moved automatically." This is not the language of triumph. This is the language of consciousness resuming. The language of a person who has been slightly absent from their own experience, noticing, with a shock that is almost embarrassing in its smallness, that they are there. There is a poet named Wisława Szymborska, the Polish Nobel laureate, who wrote a poem called Conversation with a Stone that I keep returning to because it contains something I can't fully articulate, but that feels like the clearest description I've found of the relationship between the mind's surface and the soul's depth. In the poem, the speaker asks to enter a stone, to see its interior, to understand what is inside, and the stone refuses every time, saying that its inside face is for looking, not for visiting. The poem is, among other things, a meditation on the parts of the self that are not accessible through the will, not because they're hidden in a therapeutic sense, but because they operate on a different frequency than the conscious mind, and the conscious mind's demand to enter them and take inventory is itself a kind of violation that ensures access is denied. What Szymborska understood, writing in Poland under the specific conditions of communist constraint that required a particular kind of coded language, was that the interior truth of a person, the real shape of their desire, the real weight of their grief, does not yield to the mind's organizational ambitions. It yields only when the mind goes quiet enough to hear it. And going quiet is not a skill we have been taught. We have been taught to fill. We have been taught that the absence of noise is a problem requiring a solution, that stillness is inefficiency, that the mind left without a task will produce anxiety, and anxiety must be managed by providing the mind with another task. We have been taught this so thoroughly that the simple act of sitting in silence for 10 minutes without an agenda feels, to most people alive today, like a mild emergency, and the soul which speaks in that silence, which has been waiting in that silence for however long the filling has been going on, remains unheard. Not because it stopped speaking, because we optimized ourselves out of the ability to listen. Here is a data point that I find useful not for its precision but for its general shape. Research on deathbed regret, and there is a body of it, Bronnie Ware's work being the most widely known, drawn from years of nursing terminal patients in the final period of their lives, consistently identifies not the things people wish they'd done more of in the conventional achievement sense, but the things they wish they'd stopped doing. They wish they'd stopped performing emotions they didn't feel. They wish they'd stopped working so hard in the service of a life they'd built to someone else's specifications. They wish they'd stopped telling themselves there was more time. The most consistent regret is not the risk taken and lost. The most consistent regret is the risk not taken, not because the risk would certainly have succeeded, but because the not taking of it meant spending a life at a slight but perpetual remove from one's own experience. And that removed, those people reported, compound. What starts as a small distance becomes over decades a chasm, and the chasm is where the self-estrangement lives. I want to address something directly, because I know it is alive in some part of you that is listening to this. You may be thinking, but I've tried. I have, at various points, turned toward the thing. I have attempted the creative project, the honest conversation, the career change, the relationship risk, and the admission of what I actually need. And it did not go the way I hoped. The project failed. The conversation backfired. The change cost me something I wasn't prepared to lose. The risk produced a wound rather than a revelation. And the lesson I took from that, the lesson the mind presented as obvious and evidence-based, was that turning toward the thing is dangerous, and that the safe position is the one I have. The mind called this learning. The mind called this wisdom. I understand this deeply. I'm not here to say the risk is always justified in a simple cost-benefit way, because sometimes it isn't, especially if you value outcomes and stability as the true measures. What I want to suggest, and I share this carefully because it's not a denial of failure but a new perspective on it, is that the wound from trying is not the same as the wound from not trying. The hurt from trying includes grief, humiliation, and the pain of wanting something and not getting it, of being seen wanting it. These are genuine wounds. Conversely, the wound from not trying is more subtle and pervasive. It's the wound of gradually becoming a stranger to yourself, of realizing that the person you've been maintaining doesn't feel like home. The difference matters because one of these wounds heals in the usual way, imperfectly, with scars but leading closer to oneself. The other accumulates without healing because the body can't heal what the mind refuses to recognize as injury. So, where does that leave us? I stand in this same fog, in this same place as you, not outside looking in. I have my own Thomas's cassette tape in my own metaphorical attic, my own Eleni's 15-year gap, and Priya's unopened box I've circled. I understand the relief of deciding that circling is enough, that awareness alone is an adequate substitute for actual action, that diagnosing my avoidance means I am no longer avoiding, which isn't how any of this works. I know it doesn't work that way, and yet I still do it. Because the alternative, opening the box, sitting with the piece of writing, decision, or conversation I've kept at a distance, feels like stepping off a ledge to my nervous system. Even though I know it isn't. Even though I know I'm already standing on that ledge. This is the part where I'm supposed to give you something actionable, a framework, a practice, or a set of steps. But honestly, I find myself unable to do that because the truth is there is no definitive methodology for this. It all comes down to a decision, made at whatever level you can manage, not all at once, not as a grand overhaul, but at a small scale, like a single day or hour, to let what you've been avoiding matter, to let it speak, not to promise anything to it, not to reorganize your life immediately around it, just to stop resisting it, to stop making the mind's cautious case that it's impractical, unwise, too late, or not the right time. To allow for a moment the possibility that the ache at 3 in the morning isn't a problem to be managed but a message to be received. Because here's what I know, based not on theory but on the experience of people who have faced it directly. The act of turning toward it changes the body. Before life shifts, before outcomes are clear, before risks turn into loss or gain, honest acknowledgement. The act of sitting with the soul's knowledge, rather than rushing to translate it into the mind's language of control and delay, produces something physical. Something like easing a grip that's been so habitual you no longer notice the tension. Something like a deeper breath. Something that isn't a resolution but a prerequisite for one. Contact. Contact with the true shape of your inner self. The reality that's really there, not the one you've been performing to make it seem like you're okay. Research suggests, and I'm drawing from the field of psychological change, which is sobering and worth honestly naming, that about 80% of people who have an insight that could change their lives do not act on it in any meaningful way, not because the insight is wrong, not because action is impossible, but because the nervous system's need for familiarity isn't overridden by intellectual understanding, and because the true cost of change, when honestly calculated, is usually higher than what the person expected when the insight felt electric and clear in the moment. Most people who see something like this, who feel a shift while watching, will not carry that shift into the next day. Not because they are insincere, but because the machinery of comfortable misery runs on a fuel of very good reasons. And good reasons are never scarce. I am saying this not to mock you. I am saying it because I think knowing the odds is more useful than being protected from them. You are probably not going to change, not in the way that matters, not in the way your soul has been trying to ask you to change. Not this week, maybe not this year. The box in the attic will stay closed for a while longer. The 3M will keep coming. The mind will keep building its case, and the case will keep being excellent, and the soul will keep presenting its invoice in the language of insomnia and tension, and that specific hollow quality that good days have when they're the wrong kind of good. And this is the choice, in the end, not the choice between safety and risk. That binary is too crude to be useful. The choice is between a life that is legible to other people and a life that is legible to you, between a self that is comprehensible in the light of other people's measurements and a self that is recognizable in the dark, between the version of you that photographs well and the version of you that, when the mind goes quiet at 2 in the morning, does not feel like a stranger. You already know which one you've been living. That's the whole thing. That's all I have. The soul already sent the invoice. It's been on your desk this whole time.